When evening came, Sarah, Paul, and Emily, who had overheard everything, walked to the bus stop together. The air was cold, and the streets were quiet as they waited. Emily stood beside Sarah, curiosity written all over her face. "Do you really think you'll see him again?" she asked. "I don't know," Sarah whispered. "I hope not." The minutes dragged on, and finally, the bus appeared in the distance, its headlights cutting through the night. Sarah's heart raced as it grew closer. She clenched her hands into fists, bracing herself for what she might see. The bus stopped in front of them with a soft hiss, and the doors opened. Sarah held her breath as she peered inside. The driver was not Mr. Johnson. It was a middle-aged man, wearing the standard uniform, looking back at them with a bored expression. Relief flooded Sarah's body, but there was still a nagging doubt in the back of her mind. She glanced around the bus, checking the seats for anything unusual. But there was nothing out of the ordinary. It was just an empty bus, like any other night. "See," Paul said, smiling at her. "Nothing to worry about." Sarah nodded, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. Maybe Paul was right. Maybe it had all been in her head. They watched the bus pull away, disappearing into the distance, and began the walk back home. But as they neared the house, a cold chill swept over Sarah. She turned back, staring into the darkness behind them. And then she heard it, just barely audible over the wind, the distant sound of a bus engine. This time, Paul and Emily heard it too. The distant rumble of the bus engine sent a chill through Sarah's spine, and she wasn't the only one who noticed it. Paul and Emily stopped in their tracks, their eyes scanning the empty street behind them. The sound was unmistakable, low, deep, and growing closer. "It can't be," Paul muttered, shaking his head. "We just saw the bus leave. There's no road back there." Emily, clutching Paul's arm, whispered, "Dad, do you hear that? It sounds like it's coming from the empty lot." Sarah felt her heart rate spike, her pulse echoing in her ears. She could sense it just like she had the night before. The presence, the feeling that someone or something was out there watching her. The three of them stood frozen, listening as the bus engine grew louder, louder than it should have been. Paul squinted into the darkness, his face filled with uncertainty. "This doesn't make any sense," he said, his voice low. "There's no way." Suddenly, the air around them shifted. The familiar smell of smoke, faint but distinct, drifted in, surrounding them like a thick cloud. Sarah gasped, recognizing it immediately. It was the same smell from that morning, the same scent that had filled the house when she had found the cigarette burning in the ashtray. "Paul," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's him. I know it's him." Before Paul could respond, the rumble of the engine grew impossibly loud. It was as if the bus was right behind them, but when they turned, there was nothing, just the empty lot, stretching out into the night, bathed in shadows and silence. Sarah felt a sudden compulsion to move. She grabbed Paul's arm. "We need to leave," she said urgently. "Now." But Paul, stubborn and skeptical, took a few steps toward the lot. "No," he said. "I need to see for myself. It's got to be something else." Emily pulled him back. "Dad, no. Let's go home." The three of them hurried back to the house, their steps quick and anxious. As they reached the front door, Sarah hesitated. The safety of the house didn't feel so certain anymore. She could still smell the smoke, still hear the faint hum of the bus engine in the distance. Her mind raced with thoughts of what might happen next. Inside, the house felt colder than usual, as though something had drained the warmth from the air. Sarah walked straight to the living room, her eyes darting to the spot where she had found the burning cigarette earlier. The ashtray was empty now, but the faint scent of smoke lingered in the air, unsettling her. Paul closed the door behind them, his face pale. "Okay," he said, his voice a mix of frustration and fear. "That was weird, but it doesn't mean it's him. It can't be." Sarah's eyes locked onto him. "You heard it too, Paul. You smelled it. This isn't just in my head. Mr. Johnson is still here, and I don't know why." Paul rubbed his hands over his face, struggling to process everything. "I don't know what to think," he admitted. "But whatever this is, we need to figure it out." Suddenly, a soft knock echoed through the house. It was faint, barely audible, but it made everyone freeze in place. Came again, this time louder. Emily's eyes widened. Who's at the door?" Paul moved cautiously toward the front door, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He glanced back at Sarah, who shook her head vehemently. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't open it." Paul hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and pulled the door open. There was no one there, just the quiet, still street and the soft rustling of the trees in the wind. Paul stepped out onto the porch, looking around. "There's no one," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "This is getting ridiculous." But Sarah wasn't listening. She was staring at something on the ground, just beyond the porch. Slowly, she stepped forward. Her eyes locked on a small object lying in the dirt. It was a cigarette. Her breath hitched in her throat. She knew that brand. It was the same brand Mr. Johnson used to smoke, the same cigarettes she had seen in the ashtray that morning. She knelt down, picking it up with trembling hands. The end was still smoldering. "How is this possible?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. She looked up at Paul, who was staring at the cigarette in disbelief. "He's here, Paul. He's trying to tell us something." Paul swallowed hard, struggling to keep his composure. "What are you saying, Sarah? That Mr. Johnson's ghost is haunting us?" Before Sarah could respond, they heard it again. The bus engine. This time it was unmistakably close. Too close. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as the sound seemed to come from all around them, filling the air like a thick, oppressive fog. The wind picked up, swirling around the house, carrying with it the faint smell of exhaust and smoke. And then they saw it. From the shadows of the empty lot, a figure emerged. It was faint, almost transparent, but there was no mistaking who it was. Mr. Johnson. He stood there, his eyes locked on Sarah, his face expressionless. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching. Sarah's breath came in shallow gasps as she took a step back. "Paul, do you see him?" Paul nodded slowly, his face pale. "I see him." Emily, standing behind them, gasped. "It's real, he's real." The three of them stood frozen, staring at the figure in the distance. Mr. Johnson's form flickered, like a light about to go out. And then, without warning, he turned and began walking back toward the empty lot, disappearing into the darkness. The sound of the bus engine roared to life once more, echoing through the night. But this time, Sarah wasn't afraid. She knew what she had to do. "We have to follow him," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her. "He's trying to show us something." Paul looked at her like she was crazy. "Follow him? Into the lot? Sarah, we don't even know if that's him. Could be dangerous." But Sarah shook her head, determination filling her eyes. "I have to know. I have to find out why he's here." Without waiting for a response, she started toward the empty lot, her heart pounding in her chest. Paul and Emily hesitated for a moment, then followed her into the darkness. The three of them ventured into the empty lot, their footsteps silent on the cold ground. The wind howled around them, carrying the faint scent of smoke. Sarah, Paul, and Emily ventured deeper into the empty lot, the cold wind biting at their skin, carrying the ever-present scent of cigarette smoke. Every step felt heavier, as if the air around them was thickening, making it harder to breathe. Sarah's mind raced with questions. Why was Mr. Johnson haunting her? What did he want? "Sarah, we shouldn't go too far," Paul whispered, his steps faltering as he cast nervous glances around the shadowy landscape. Emily clung to his hand, her eyes wide with fear but equally filled with curiosity. But Sarah was determined. She couldn't stop now. She had to know why Mr. Johnson's ghost was haunting her and what unfinished business had brought him back. Her heart pounded, but she pushed forward, her eyes fixed on the distant edge of the lot, where Mr. Johnson had disappeared into the darkness. Suddenly, the wind died down, and the air grew eerily still. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint rustling of the dry grass beneath their feet. Then, out of the shadows, the sound of footsteps echoed. Steady, deliberate, and coming closer. Paul stopped in his tracks, his grip tightening around Emily's hand. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded, her throat tight with tension. She could feel it. Something was coming, and it was getting closer. The footsteps grew louder, until finally, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was Mr. Johnson. He stood just a few feet away from them, his ghostly form flickering in the dim light. His face was ashen, his eyes hollow, and the cigarette that Sarah had smelled so many times was clenched between his pale lips. He didn't speak. He just stood there, staring at Sarah with an expression of deep sorrow and regret. "Mr. Johnson," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking, "what do you want from me?" The ghost didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his worn jacket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. With slow, deliberate movements, he held it out to Sarah. Hesitantly, she stepped forward and took the paper from his hand. As soon as her fingers touched the note, a rush of cold air enveloped her, and a strange sensation washed over her. A mixture of sadness and guilt, emotions that didn't belong to her but to the ghost standing before her. She unfolded the paper, her hands trembling. Scrawled across it in messy handwriting were the words, "I'm sorry, I couldn't save her." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "Her? Who are you talking about?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Mr. Johnson's form flickered again, growing fainter. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Instead, his gaze shifted to Emily, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. He reached out a hand toward her, but before he could make contact, his figure dissolved into the wind, leaving only the smell of cigarette smoke behind. For a long moment, no one spoke. Sarah stared at the note in her hand, her mind reeling. Paul looked at her, his expression a mix of confusion and concern. "What does it mean? Who couldn't he save?" he asked. Sarah shook her head, unable to tear her eyes away from the message. "I don't know," she whispered, "but I think we need to find out." They turned to leave the lot, but as they did, something caught Sarah's eye. At the far edge of the field, beneath an old, gnarled tree, there was a small, weathered gravestone, barely visible through the overgrown grass. "Wait," she said, pointing toward the tree. "Do you see that?" Paul squinted into the darkness. "Is that a grave?" They made their way toward the gravestone, the air growing colder with every step. When they reached it, Sarah knelt down, brushing the dirt and leaves away from the stone. The inscription was faded, but after a moment, she could make out the name, Lily Johnson. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Lily? Was she his daughter? Paul crouched beside her, his brow furrowed. "I didn't know he had a daughter." Sarah looked up at him, her heart heavy. "Maybe that's why he's here," she said softly. "Maybe he's been carrying the guilt of losing her, and he needs someone to help him find peace." Emily, who had been standing quietly behind them, suddenly spoke up. "Maybe he was trying to save her, but he couldn't. That's why he's so sad." Sarah nodded, a lump forming in her throat. "That must be it," she said. "He needs us to help him let go." As they stood there, the wind picked up again, carrying the faint echo of Mr. Johnson's footsteps. Sarah looked around, her heart filled with a strange sense of closure. She didn't know exactly what had happened to Lily or why Mr. Johnson had come to her, but she knew one thing. She had to help him find peace. "Tomorrow," she said, standing up and brushing off her hands, "we'll come back and figure this out. Maybe then we can finally help him move on." Paul nodded in agreement, though he still looked uneasy. "I just hope this is the last time we see him." But as they walked back to the house, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. There were still questions that needed answers, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to face the truth of what had really happened to Lily Johnson. One thing was certain, though. They were far from done with Mr. Johnson's ghost. The next morning, Sarah woke up with a sense of purpose, the image of Lily Johnson's gravestone fresh in her mind. She knew they had to go back to the lot, but this time they needed to dig deeper, figuratively and literally. Whatever had happened to Mr. Johnson's daughter was tied to his haunting presence, and Sarah was determined to find out more. Over breakfast, Sarah shared her thoughts with Paul. Emily sat quietly, listening intently, her usual brightness dulled by the events of the previous night. Paul, still skeptical but wanting to support Sarah, finally nodded. "All right," he said, sipping his coffee. "But if we're going to do this, we need more information. We need to look into Mr. Johnson's past. Find out what happened to Lily." Sarah agreed. They spent the morning researching, digging through old records and local news archives. The Johnson family had lived in the neighborhood for decades, but there was little information about Lily herself. However, one article from many years ago caught Sarah's eye. It was a small obituary. Lily Johnson had died at the age of 10. The cause of death was listed as accidental drowning. "That's it?" Paul asked, leaning over her shoulder to read the article. "She drowned." Sarah's brow furrowed. "It says she drowned, but that doesn't explain why Mr. Johnson would be haunting us. Why the guilt?" Emily, who had been sitting at the table, spoke up softly. "Maybe he was supposed to save her, but couldn't." Sarah's heart sank. It made sense. If Mr. Johnson had been present when Lily drowned but wasn't able to save her, the guilt could have weighed on him for years, even after death. "We need to go back to the grave," Sarah said. "There's something more to this." Later that afternoon, Sarah, Paul, and Emily returned to the empty lot. The cold wind still lingered, and the air was thick with the same unsettling feeling that had haunted them the night before. As they approached Lily's grave, Sarah knelt down again, this time noticing something she hadn't seen before: an engraving on the side of the gravestone, partially covered by dirt and grass. "Paul, help me clear this," Sarah said, her hands trembling as they brushed away the earth. Together, they revealed a faint inscription. It wasn't just a memorial for Lily. It was a plea. "I'm sorry, Lily. I failed you. I'll never forgive myself." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. This was carved by Mr. Johnson," she whispered. "He never forgave himself for what happened." Paul's expression darkened. "But why come to you? Why now?" Before Sarah could answer, the wind picked up again, swirling around them like a vortex. The smell of cigarette smoke grew stronger, and once again, the familiar rumble of the bus engine filled the air. They turned toward the sound, but this time, there was no physical bus, just the ghostly echo of it, circling the lot. And then there he was. Mr. Johnson's ghost stood at the edge of the field, just as he had the night before, watching them. But this time, his expression was different. It wasn't just sorrow, it was anguish. Sarah took a deep breath, standing tall as she approached the apparition. "Mr. Johnson," she called out, her voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at her. "We know about Lily. We know you tried to save her, but it wasn't your fault." The ghost flickered, his form unstable. He took a step closer, the air around him heavy with unspoken pain. His mouth opened, but the words were barely a whisper, carried away by the wind. "I failed her," he rasped, his voice filled with regret. "She called for me, but I didn't reach her in time." Sarah's heart ached for him. She took another step toward him, speaking softly, gently. "You've been carrying this guilt for too long. It's time to let go. Lily wouldn't want you to suffer like this." For a moment, Mr. Johnson's ghost stood motionless, as if her words had reached something deep within him. His figure flickered again, growing fainter, but he didn't vanish. He was still holding on, still unable to release the weight of his guilt. Paul and Emily joined Sarah, standing by her side. Paul, who had been doubtful all along, now looked at Mr. Johnson with a mixture of sympathy and understanding. "You loved her," he said, "and you did everything you could, but it's time to move on." Mr. Johnson's eyes met Paul's, and for the first time, the sorrow in them seemed to ease, just a little. Then, Emily spoke, her voice soft but sure. "Lily wouldn't blame you. She knows you tried. You can find peace now." The ghost's form wavered, and for a brief moment, A faint smile touched his lips. Slowly, he raised his hand, as if to say goodbye. The wind swirled around him one last time, and with a final, lingering glance at Sarah and her family, Mr. Johnson's figure dissolved into the air, leaving only the faint smell of smoke behind. Silence settled over the lot. Sarah exhaled, the tension in her body finally releasing. "He's gone," she whispered, almost in disbelief. "He's finally gone." Paul wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "You did it. You helped him find peace." Emily smiled softly, her eyes still fixed on the spot where Mr. Johnson had stood. "He's with Lily now," she said. "He's not alone anymore." The three of them stood there for a moment longer, taking in the stillness of the lot. The wind had died down, and for the first time since the haunting began, the air felt warm and calm. As they made their way back to the house, Sarah couldn't help but glance back at Lily's grave one last time. She knew that both Lily and Mr. Johnson had finally found the peace they deserved. But more than that, Sarah had found something too. An understanding that sometimes, even in death, people need help letting go. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the lot in a soft, golden glow, Sarah smiled to herself. It was over. The haunting had ended. And so had the story of Mr. Johnson's endless sorrow.